Hi, welcome to this video. Today I'm going to do a quick demo about how to create a TanStack Start app using Pocketbase as the database and adding authentication to the app. TanStack Start is the new React framework that recently released, and Pocketbase is a little database server that is great for starting new projects, super easy to use and set up, and most importantly, it has built-in authentication, so that whole concern is going to be handled for us as long as we can integrate it into the app. So this demo is going to do that. I'll create a little app that has a home page, a login page, a logout route, and a dashboard that's protected only for authenticated users. So I'm just going to go straight from scratch and do this pretty much as quickly as I can, and I'm just going to get started with it. So here I am on the TanStack Start docs, and they have a quick start page where you can copy a script here and run that to get a little boilerplate app going. So where I'm running this is a folder where I have a lint file and a git ignore, but it might as well be an empty folder. It's meant to be run without anything to start with. I'm going to adjust it slightly just because I have a folder already, but you could run it without any of this stuff. Okay, cool. Quickly got that run, and we have all of our app files here. So I'm going to then run npm install to get the packages installed. Okay, cool. Once the packages are installed, we can run npm run dev to start the app. App starts on localhost 3000. So if I go to localhost 3000 and refresh, we see that the app is running here. This is just the standard boilerplate app that we downloaded. So it has, a little nav bar with home, posts, and users and all this stuff. So that is what we want to see. So for the purposes of this demo, I don't actually want any of that stuff in there. So I'm going to quickly go in and delete most of it out. So into routes, we're going to get rid of everything except for root and index. Root is the common entry point for TanStack Start app, so we can't delete that. And index is going to be our home page, so we will need that too. Everything else can go though. Okay, that's all gone. So now that I refresh the app, we see the same thing, but all of these links should point at routes that no longer exist. So we see that when we click on them, we get the fallback page that says they're not there anymore. So that's expected. So the next step is I'm going to go into root and clear out all the stuff we don't need, which is pretty much most of the stuff in here. So instead, I'll add a little bit of structure that will be more helpful for understanding the sort of app that we're building. Okay, we have a basic structure here, so if we go back to the home page, we should see that we have an area for a sidebar, area for the route to render. So now that we have that, I'm going to go back and build like a minimal sidebar to represent the 4 routes that we said earlier. I'll use TanStack router links to do that. So we have home, login, logout, and dashboard. That is what we want to see. I'm going to go back and add a little bit of treatment on these so that we can tell which one we're on at any given time. Cool, so now whichever route we're on should light up bold. It's kind of hard to tell, but it is happening. So now that we have that implemented, we want to go and create some scaffolding for these 3 routes that we want that don't exist yet. So I won't get too far into the TanStack router like file-based routing system, but just a little bit about it. It's based on your file structure, right? So if you have a folder A that has a subfolder B and then a subfolder C under that, any components that you write there will be rendered out to routes that exist at A/B/C. So that's pretty much what we want to do, except for there's one slightly more advanced technique that we'll be using here, which is virtual routes. A virtual route is basically a route segment that you can define as virtual. You do that by using a leading underscore on the name of the route. So for example, if we had like, instead of ABC, if we had A_BC, then the route that would be produced at that location would be A/C. So the B part would be omitted. The reason for doing that is that we want to write a component, like an intermediary component for our authorized area that won't render anything, but it will provide logic that applies to all the dependents. So basically, for the protected area that we make, we want to, in the component file there, describe the fact that you need to be authorized to access any of the descendants underneath of there. So to do that, I'm going to make a new folder called logged in. So anything underneath of here, by the time we're done, you'll need to be logged in to access that. So underneath of there, I'll make a dashboard component. I'll make another virtual route segment called auth. There's no functional reason for this, but I just want a place to organize the login and logout routes. Okay, cool. So we have those routes set up. So if we go back to the app, refresh, we should see that as we navigate around, we are landing on the correct routes that we expect. Perfect. And as you can see, they're all rendered just off the root, even though they have that virtual intermediary path. Okay, that's good. So I think at this point, what we should do is go and install Pocketbase into the app. So to do that, I'm first going to install the Pocketbase client. I'm also going to install a couple other packages that I didn't do at first. The first one is just biome so that I can lint the files I have. And the last one is concurrently. The reason we want this is so that we can build a script that will run the TanStack Start app and the Pocketbase server at the same time. Okay, cool. So we have those packages. Now what we need to do is to download the actual Pocketbase server. So if we go to Pocketbase, they have a docs page. And on the very first page of the docs, there's this area to download the server. So just choose the one that applies to you. I'm going to use the Mac one here. I've downloaded this many times, so you can see in here. But I'm going to take the Pocketbase executable and drag that over into my application. The one thing I forgot to do and that I'm going to do right now is I'm going to make a new folder called DB, and I'm going to put Pocketbase in there instead. The reason for doing that is that since Pocketbase is a SQLite database, like as we use the database, it's going to write files like data files and migration files, and it's just easier to keep all those organized. So I prefer to keep them, separate in a DB folder like this. So now that we have that set up, we want to go back to the package.json and adjust the dev script so that it will run not just the TanStack Start app, but also the Pocketbase server. So we'll use concurrently to do that. And Pocketbase serve is the command to run that server. So now when we run npm run dev, it should start both of them for us. Right, so if you're on a Mac at least, the one thing to notice on this is that the first time you run Pocketbase, it's going to be like unverified. So you'll have to go into your security settings to allow it to run. So if you go down to the bottom, it will show up here after we decline this alert. So now we see Pocketbase was blocked. I click allow anyway. And the next time I run this dev command, we can tell it to open anyway. Somehow that didn't work, but I'm just going to do it again. I think I somehow need to allow it twice. Okay. Well, that works. So whenever you do that, it's for, and you access Pocketbase's UI for the first time, it's going to prompt you to create a super user. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So once you create the super user, you get dropped into this Pocketbase admin area. And what you can notice here is we already have a users table. So every instance of Pocketbase comes with this users table. And from this users table, Pocketbase is going to offer us an authentication service, for free out of the box. So we don't really have to do anything here in order to, have a small authentication service in our app besides add a user. So I'll add a test user. It doesn't really matter if we click verified right now because we're not going to use this in our app. In real life, you can, require your users to like verify their email address and stuff like that. But for now, we'll just assume this person's already verified. Okay, so you can see we have our user record here. So we're ready to go ahead and build some of the authentication stuff into our app. The first thing we need to do is get a Pocketbase client instance. So to do that, we're going to go into utils. I'm going to add a file called pb.ts. And in here, I'm going to import Pocketbase. And just create a new instance here. Create the new instance and export it. So, since TanStack Start and, most of these kind of frameworks are request-based, meaning, the things that we instantiate are going to exist for the lifetime of the request. It makes sense to just instantiate the client once and then export it. And if we need to refer to the client throughout the course of the request, we can just import from here and use the same client, that was instantiated for the beginning of the request. So that's all we need to do on the Pocketbase file. Next thing I'm going to do is to go and create a new file that's called auth. And this is where we'll implement 3 functions. We'll do logout, login, and authenticate. So at this point, one thing to know about the Pocketbase client auth system is that it's a cookie-based auth system. So basically, if the client, can find a valid cookie, then it will consider you to be authenticated, and it can authenticate with that cookie. The cookie contains a token that it can use to authenticate. If it doesn't have the cookie, or if the cookie is expired or old or whatever, then it won't be authenticated. So there's basically 2 states to worry about, and it just depends on whether or not we have a valid cookie. The one thing about the cookie is that by default, it's an HTTP only cookie, meaning the browser can't read from or write to that cookie. So that gets a little confusing if we're using this in a case of like a TanStack Start where we have a browser context and a server context. It might be confusing to sort of manage like where in that application we can access the cookie, etc. So there's a way that we're going to use where we ensure that we only ever interact with the Pocketbase client in a server context. And the way that we can do that is to use the built-in function create server function that's provided by TanStack Start. So if we define our functions this way, it means that the internals of this function will only ever be run in a server context. We can still run these functions in a browser or a non-server context, but if we run it in the browser, like it will just be executed as a network request. So we don't really have to worry about managing the client, the client side of the Pocketbase client. So I'll start with logout because that's the easiest and simplest one. But first of all, we'll do create server function, and we'll add a handler. Handler is pretty much like the generic way to implement the internals of the function. So all we really need to do to log out of the app, since we just said before, there's either like you have the cookie or you don't, we're going to just tell the PB client, well, we need to import the PB client singleton also here. After we do that, we can just say PB auth store clear. That will tell the client to just forget about the token and the cookie that it might know about. The other thing we're going to do is to tell our request to forget the cookie too. So we can use this function called delete cookie. Make sure you choose the one. So you can see like the suggestion is from Vinxi server. Don't choose that one. If you're going to write this for TanStack Start, choose the one that's provided by TanStack Start. And the cookie name is PB auth, so we can just use that. So this is all we need to do to implement a logout. This is sufficient for logging us out if we're logged in, and we can just be done there. Okay, login is a little bit more complicated. Since this is going to receive form data, we need to provide an email and a password to this function. We need to add another sort of like middleware in this chain, which is validator. And the validator is going to accept form data. And it's going to produce a plain object that has email and password. Oh, it's auto-completing a little bit too much. I believe this needs to be a string, so I'm just going to do that right away. Okay, so this validator takes the form data, and it's going to return a plain object with email and password string. And after defining this validator, then we can write a handler like we did before, which will receive that object from the validator. So something important to know for the handler is that it receives stuff from the validator under the data key. So we have to make sure to include that. Okay, so that looks right. Inside of the handler, we basically need to do like the inverse of what we did for logout. So we need to call this function on the PB client, which is PB collection users auth with password with our email and password. So that will be a network request to Pocketbase that will authenticate with the information we provide. So after we do that, we want to, instead of deleting the cookie when we log out, we want to set the cookie this time. So we need to choose set cookie again from TanStack Start. And to get the actual cookie content, we can use PB auth store export to cookie. Oh, there we go. Okay. That should be sufficient for our login function, so that should take care of everything. I'll just return a result just in case we need to use that for anything. Finally, we're going to implement the authenticate function. So the authenticate function is kind of like a combination of the other stuff we've done with login, logout. It's pretty simple still, but it's again just like management of that cookie lifecycle and the Pocketbase client. So for authenticate, we're again going to create a server function, and we're going to go straight to the handler. So there's a few scenarios to be aware of in the authenticate function. The first thing is if we don't have, or if the client is not authenticated, try to authenticate with the cookie. So what we need to do is check PB auth store is valid. Oops. Oh no. So we're going to check PB auth store is valid. If it's not valid, we're going to get the cookie from the request and try to authenticate the client with that cookie. So the method on PB auth store is actually load from cookie. So this will, authenticate the client with the cookie if we have one. The next thing is if we're authenticated, refresh the token. So there's a JWT token in the cookie, and if we have one, we want to call Pocketbase and tell it to refresh our token. That way, the lifetime of the token stays open for longer, and we won't like get logged out of our app as we're using it, kind of thing. Okay, so to do that, we can say if our auth store is valid, then we want to call the users collection and auth refresh. And important to note that this function is async, so we need to await that. Okay, the next thing we need to do is to set the cookie in any case. So basically, the reason behind that is that, no matter if we're authenticated or not, we want to make sure to persist that state back up to the cookie. So we're going to use the same thing we did before in the login function and just set the cookie down here. And finally, we're going to return PB auth store record. And the kind of cool thing is on the Pocketbase client that the PB auth store record represents a user record for whoever is authenticated at that time. So the cookie itself actually contains like the JSON object of the user. So it's pretty handy that we can, if we're authenticated, just access the user all the time from the client auth store. So this is pretty much it. I'm just scrolling up to make sure that we have everything we need. But I think we do. So, okay, I think now at this point we can start implementing some of these auth functions in our various routes. So let's start with logout, because again, I think that's the easiest one. Okay, cool. So here's our route component for logout. There's a few different ways to implement this. Something to notice in TanStack Start is these route structures, they have like a route lifecycle hook available to them. We can render the component here in this component hook, but there's also a before load hook and a loader hook that you have access to use. Since a logout route doesn't really need to render anything, it sort of makes sense to implement the logout in the before load or loader hooks. But the issue with that in our app is that since we're using links here on the left, those functions actually get called when you like interact with the link. Like it's kind of like a preload for that route. So I'll just show that real quick. But if we had like a before load function here, I'll just console log from here. But if we refresh our app, we could see that, it's running the before load function in the console, like as we just hover over logout. So we don't want that to happen in our app because, we'll get logged out every time we like hover over the link. So there may be a more elegant way to like avoid that, but for this purpose, I'm just going to implement the logout in the actual browser component. So this component doesn't need to return anything. We'll return null. It doesn't need to render, but does need to log out. So let's do that. We'll write a use effect where we log out. And we'll, after logging out, navigate to homepage, somewhere else. So that should be good enough, and we can hopefully test that right now. Okay, so back in the app, when we test our logout route, we can see that as we click it, we're quickly accessing the logout route, but it's kicking us straight back to home. So that's exactly what we want. Okay, so next let's implement the login route. So I'm going to go into login, and we're going to need a form. So I'll build like a simple form for this. Okay, let's try it out. We have a simple form. You can kind of hardly see it, so I might change the style up just quickly so that we can see it a little better. Okay, cool. That's a little bit easier to see. Okay, so we have a form. We can add a handle submit function to it. So importantly, this handle submit is going to receive a submit event. We want to prevent default on the submit event from, to prevent it from flowing any further than it is right now. We don't want it to like continue on the event chain here. We want to stop it and handle it inside the function. So we'll call prevent default. We'll get the form data off of the event. And with the form data, we need to call our login function. Okay, cool. So that should be enough to log us in. Oh, right. This needs to be called in a data key here. That's the issue. Awesome. So if we log in, we also want to navigate from here. So we'll do navigate back to home. And we'll use navigate. Okay, cool. Since this is a form and it's bound to have errors in it, we should also add just like basic error handling. So we can add a try catch around this login function, catch the error, and if we get an error, we'll just set that state so that we can show it in our form. Cool, so we should be capturing the error in state here, and then we'll just add a place in the form to show the error, like if we get one. Okay, let's just add some nonsense to see if we can see the error treatment. Oh no, it works somehow. I think we need to adjust our function. So it seems like it did not, oh, we did not put the navigate in the try catch. So that's the reason. Let's go back and try the login again. Cool, so we see that we have an error now, and it's actually coming from the Pocketbase client, so that's a good sign. Like it tried to authenticate and it wasn't able to. So that's what we see here. Let's put our real user credentials in and see if that works. Awesome, it worked. Okay, we're in, we logged in. So at this point, it might be interesting to kind of take a look at the cookies. So to do that, we can go into the application tab, and you can find the cookies in, the cookies area here under your whatever host you're running. So we're in localhost, and we see the PB auth cookie here, which is exactly what we want to see. And we see this giant cookie. So just like at a quick glance, the giant cookie pretty much is going to indicate that you're logged in successfully. If you're logged out, we'll either see no cookie here, meaning it was deleted by our logout function, or we'll see a cookie that is like way smaller, meaning it doesn't have any content, so it's like an invalid cookie or a cookie that's missing a token. So when we see this huge cookie, that pretty much means we're logged in. If we see something else, that will mean we're not logged in. So since we have login and logout, we should be able to use both of those now and see the cookie like toggle between the authenticated state. So let's hit logout, and you see that the cookie was just straight up deleted, so that's good. Now if we go back to login, we can type in our user again. And when we do that, we can see that we get the cookie back, or we get a different cookie back, but we're authenticated. So this is exactly what we want so far. So the last thing is, now that we're authenticated, we want to restrict access to the dashboard route based on whether or not we're authenticated. So currently, like if we log out, you can see we have no cookie, but we can still access the dashboard, right? Because we didn't add any handling to like kick you out of this area if you're not logged in. So let's do that right now with our authenticate function that we wrote earlier. So to do that, I'm going to add a virtual route for the logged in area. And this will be the handler that gets gets executed when we're accessing routes underneath of logged in. So this will be part of the route chain, but it just won't render anything. So just to capture that right off the bat, we want to just render this thing called outlet, which just says to like render, the next thing in the route chain. So what we do want to do is implement our authenticate function here and then kick the user out if they're not authenticated. So to do that, I'm going to use the before load function, or hook, I guess. This function receives context from the caller, so I'm just going to continue like returning context even though we don't need it just now. Oh, I messed up a little bit. There we go. What we do need to do in this before load is to call our auth function. So if you remember from our auth function, if we go back to it, it returns a PB auth store record if it's, well, it always returns it. If we have a valid client, like a valid authenticated client, that record will be the user object. If it's not authenticated, it will be null. So we can use that to apply different treatments in our logged in space. So let's say user is the result of awaiting authenticate. And that's pretty much it. Now we know at this point whether or not we're authenticated, and we just need to react to that. So let's say if there's not a user, we will redirect to login. I think we actually want to throw this. I'm not sure, but I know you can't just call redirect. You at least need to return off of it or throw it. If you don't do that, the redirect won't really do anything, and it's pretty confusing. So let's just do this for now. So my expectation is if we go to dashboard and we try to access it when we're logged out, it should kick us out back to login. Let's try. Cool. Did that just happen? It did, because our token is invalid right now. We can tell, as we said before, because it's a shorter cookie. You can even see in the cookie somewhere, like there's the word null. You can deserialize this if you want, and you can read like all the content of the cookie, but just at a glance, we can tell that this is invalid. Okay, so I'm gonna just test that, if we keep hitting dashboard, we're kicked out, right? Because we're not authenticated, just from the logic we just applied. So it's kicking us back to login. That's what we expect. So let's log back in. And when we log in, this is the moment of truth. Let's see, we should be able to access the dashboard. Awesome, we can. Okay, so that means that we have implemented this guard correctly. So, any path underneath of logged in will get this treatment, and it will require us to be authenticated to access that area. Let's see, one other thing we can do from here is we can actually pass this user object that we have here on this line. We can pass this to the component, like if we actually want to do anything with the user. So let's just do that as the final step. The way to do that is, instead of just returning context here, we can return the context with the user on it. Like we can adjust the context basically and pass it to the next thing in the chain. So since we only care about this for the dashboard right now, let's go into dashboard. And the hook that will receive that context is a loader hook. So let's go ahead and add a loader hook. So it's going to receive the context, and it's going to return something that is going to be accessible to our rendered component in the app. So right now, let's just return context.user. That's a good start. Let's just console log this so that we can make sure it's what we expect. But if we go into dashboard, we look at our console, we can see that it is coming through this thing that we just logged out. So that's good. That's very close to being accessible in our actual component. So to access the data in the actual browser side of the component, what we need to do is use this hook called use loader data. And actually, the way to call that here is to use route.useLoaderData. And we can pluck the user just off of it, right? So we're returning this object with a user. We can pluck the user off here and then access it in the component. So let's do this and just print out the user basically that we're plucking off of the prior lifecycle hook there. Cool, so there's the user. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think we have done what we set out to do. We built an app that has a login page, a logout page, a public homepage, and a protected dashboard. So that was pretty much the lightest weight way of doing this that I could possibly do. And I hope you enjoyed watching this. Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully it helped you do this a little bit faster than you otherwise would. So thanks again.